Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Basic Nation Analysis, and tonight I almost said, yeah, it is tonight. Tonight, we are taking a look at Late Age Ulm, the last of the three, the Black Forest. Late Age Ulm is a little bit different. Well, both Early and Middle Age Ulm are different from each other, but Late Age Ulm kind of takes a completely separate tack. Both Early and Middle Age Ulm were very much about earth magic, very much about troops. Late Age Ulm is not. So Late Age Ulm, story-wise and thematically, this is kind of like the Germany of the Brothers Grimm. This is the Germany with the dark forests with the witches hiding in them that eat children. This is the Germany that vampire stories of European myth came from. Late Age Ulm is not a troop nation in the way that Early Age and Middle Age Ulm were. Late Age Ulm still has decent troops. In fact, it has some very good troops. But primarily the strength of Late Age Ulm is in their mages, and particularly in their summons, especially one particular summon that I'll talk about. So, commander-wise, Late Age Ulm has ranger captains, which are stealthy, crossbow-wielding. Late Age Ulm has ranger captains, which are stealthy, crossbow-wielding leaders. They have commanders of Ulm, which are a lot like the Middle Age commanders of Ulm, except worse. Late Age commanders have much lower protection, interestingly. Broadswords instead of the heavy weapons that earlier commanders of Ulm tended to use. They do still have high defense skill because they still use tower shields. And they still have the national low magic resistance that all Ulmish troops have. They do cost quite a bit less resources, so that's a nice plus. They have Black Acolytes. Black Acolytes are just level 1 priests. They have a 10% chance to have a level of Earth. They only cost 1 recruitment point. And, interestingly, Ulm starts off with a 3 recruitment point capital, which isn't that uncommon in the Late Age. It does mean you can crap out 3 of these guys per turn if you really, really want to. And a fraction of them, 10% of them, so on average 1 every 3 or 4 turns, will have a level of Earth magic and can cast Iron Blizzard. Now, I think that's a poor strategy, but it is a strategy. They are Inquisitors, so they count as Priest level 2 for the purpose of reducing other people's domain. The first actual mage Ulm gets is the Illuminated one, which can be recruited outside forts, which is an interesting facet of theirs. Illuminated ones are stealthy, very stealthy, and they are spies. They're also Astral level 1, and relatively efficient researchers. So having these guys, especially foreign recruit, means that Ulm can amass a lot of astral magic, and they can build very, very effective communions, especially if they upgrade their forts to have 3 recruitment points each, which they can do. You can get 3 of these guys every 2 turns, which is not bad. Stealthy communion slave mages, pretty good, especially when combined with the members of the second tier, who are also stealthy, have level 2 astral and blood, and 10% of them have a random that may include fire or death. Members of the second tier are extremely effective, and communions formed of primarily illuminated ones backing up members of the second tier can be very effective at casting astral spells. The blood is mainly useful in that it's blood magic, that you can use these guys to blood hunt, and of course they are foreign recruit, which is nice. Late Age Ulm does have access to Black Priests, and Black Priests are Holy level 2, Earth level 1, with a random that can include Earth, Air, Fire, or Astral, so a good bit more versatile than Middle Age Ulm. You do still have the Iron Blizzard power, especially because Black Priests are not cap only. These guys can be recruited in any fort. They're a little bit more expensive, but they do good work, and they do still have a forge bonus. It's only 1. So they can't do they can't pull the 1 gem basic items trick that Middle Age Ulm can pull, but you can still forge basic items for 2 gems, which isn't bad. They're also Inquisitors, they're sacred. Having these guys around to back up your troops with Iron Blizzard can be very useful. It's a little bit less useful in the Late Age than in the Middle Age, I feel, but still, Iron Blizzard is a very, very neat trick. This is a very interesting one, the Wolf Herd. 1 recruitment point, 50 gold. Stealthy, Animal Awe, so animals don't really attack them. Inspirational -1, but Beastmasters +3, couple of survivals, all that's kind of interesting. The really interesting thing about wolf hordes is if you set them to summon allies, they spawn 2 wolves per turn. And wolves are garbage troops, absolutely garbage. But wolf herds spawn 2 of them per turn forever. And they're only 1 recruitment point, so you can crap out 3 of them per turn from your capital. You can only recruit these guys in the capital. That can add up to a lot of wolves. Like a lot of wolves. If you spend your first year recruiting wolf herds while you're expanding, you end up with many, many wolves. I believe the math is if you spend 12 turns recruiting wolf herds, you end up with 72 wolves per turn from your capital. And you never have, without doing any further recruitment. That is actually really, really handy for Late Age Ulm specifically, because wolves are excellent patrollers, because they're so cheap, and they don't cost upkeep. Ghoul Commanders. This is what happened to the Guardians, basically. When Ulm collapsed during the Civil War, and something called the Malediction, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail a little bit later, the Guardians were besieged in the Keep of Ulm, and they fell into cannibalism and cursed themselves to become ghouls. So they are undead, they're poison resistant, they don't eat, they still have their castle defense bonus, and they still have their black halberds. But now they're just undead, and very, very high strength. They still have black steel armor, so they still have super high protection. You have the Hochmeisters, who are the leaders of the Black Templars. These are the Black Knights of Middle Age Ulm, but now they're sacred. That's basically the only difference. Hochmeisters are combat casters, however their only paths are holy level 1. Generally, I would say Hochmeisters are not really worth it, but if you want to expand specifically with Black Templars, could be. And last but definitely not least, you have Fortune Tellers. They can only be recruited in the capital, but they have 1 astral and a random, which can include death, nature, or blood. These are fantastic paths to have, especially with astral, because it means you can form small communions with illuminated ones of, say, 4 slaves that can kick you up to have high-level astral death cross path, high-level astral nature cross path. Fortune Tellers are pretty good mages. In addition, they're Fortune Teller 15. So if you stack up a few turns worth of Fortune Tellers in your capital, then you will never have a bad, or almost never have a bad event in your capital, which is very, very nice. So that's Ulm's commanders. Here's the interesting thing. Ulm has blood. At first blush, it doesn't seem like hugely efficient blood. You have it on Fortune Tellers, but it's a 25% random. You have it on members of the 2nd tier, but it's a little bit expensive. Ulm doesn't have really efficient blood hunters. But, and I'm gonna move on to show you this before I talk about the units. But if you go into spells, Ulm has a national blood spell. It costs 3 blood and requires 3 death. It only costs 44 blood slaves. It summons a vampire count. And it's 0 research. You can cast it at the start of the game. Now, vampire counts, if you'll recall, at level 7 you have the spell Curse of Blood. That summons vampire lords. It requires 77 blood slaves. Vampire lords have 3 levels of blood and 3 levels of death and can summon more vampire lords. Vampire counts have 2 blood and 2 death. So they're worse than vampire lords, but, and this is the important thing, they're still immortal. And they still spawn other vampires, the unit type of vampires, and they're still invulnerable, and they still fly. Basically, they have all the qualities of vampire lords that make them so incredibly powerful. They just have slightly lower paths. Well, you can buff their paths. Like, that's not hard. In particular, buffing their blood is not hard because they are blood hunters. They have 2 blood. They can blood hunt efficiently right out of the gate. What this does is it single-handedly makes Ulm an incredibly dangerous blood nation, because as long as you have somebody who has blood and death, this will be your pretender god. As long as you take a pretender god with blood and death cross paths, Ulm can start summoning cut price knockoff vampire lords, which normally can't be summoned until like year 3 or 4. Right out of the gate. Year 1. Year 1. By turn 12, Ulm can be summoning a vampire count. Ulm, by year 12, Ulm may well have two vampire counts. Like, if you take a high-level blood pretender and just start blood hunting your capital right away, you could easily build up 44 slaves by turn 9 or 10, summon a vampire count, have him help blood hunt your capital, be patrolling your capital with tons of wolves that you are free spawning from your wolf herds to keep unrest down. You'll lose population, but having vampires year 1 is a huge advantage. It's such a huge advantage. So, this is why wolf herds are effective, because wolf herds spawn wolves, and wolves are fantastic patrollers. This is why fortune tellers are nice, because fortune tellers random blood, and you can recruit 3 of them every 2 turns. This is why members of the second tier are nice, because you can build forts somewhere, start crapping them out. They are stealthy, so other people can't see you moving them around. They can see them blood hunting once they start doing that, but having especially the astral blood cross paths is incredibly valuable. You can empower these guys in blood just a little bit and use them to send horrors. Ulm can pull off all kinds of crazy blood shenanigans just because they have access to 0 research summonable blood hunters and death casters. All of your vampire counts can they can go into combat and cast Horde of Skeletons. They can summon other death creatures. You can give them, they can forge themselves skull staffs and become death 3. You can use them to summon mound fiends once you get up there. They can sight search for death. They can do everything that you need to break into big death. So, also, you get 2 death gems per turn. As Ulm, you also get nature and astral. Unit-wise, late age Ulm's units are objectively inferior to middle age Ulm's units. Like, I'm just going to say that. They can recruit villains right out the bat, which are stealthy but also undisciplined and not terribly cheap. I mean, they're cheap, but they're not like Helix cheap. Pikeneers are middle age Ulm pikes, but worse. Lower protection. I would say not worth it. They don't have shields. They don't have the kind of protection they need to survive in the age of crossbows. And they're not fast. Halberdiers have... The problem with Halberds is they have an attack penalty. They do a lot of damage. So Halberdiers can be decent if you want to fight heavily protected units. But an attack of 9 is just so damaging. It's so hard to use effectively. They do have a castle defense bonus. So they have 1.1 points of siege defense instead of 0.5 or 0.6 like most humans do. So if you need castle defense, you can pump out a whole bunch of Halberdiers, but overall I would say they're mediocre. Infantry of Ulm, they only have 1 type now. They're armed with Morning Stars and Tower Shields, which gives them a decent defense skill and makes them highly resilient against arrows. So Infantry of Ulm ain't bad. They do decent damage, blunt or piercing randomly. They're okay. They're fairly solid. I would say Rangers are probably the best general purpose unit Ulm has. They are stealthy, cheap crossbows. That's all they are, and that's enough. They don't require huge numbers of recruitment points. Their resource cost is low. Their gold cost is not unreasonable. They can hide. They can move quickly through forests. Rangers of Ulm are pretty solid units, and if they're pushed into melee, yes, their protection and defense are low, but at least they can deal damage because they have axes that do 19 slash. So that's not bad. The Zweihanders are your kind of elite line infantry. They have very high protection, which is nice because it makes them very hard to hurt. They also have high attack, high damage, greatsword attacks, and an almost acceptable defense skill. The downside to them is encumbrance 7 and combat speed 7. They move very slowly, they build up a lot of fatigue in combat. Any spell that increases fatigue spells doom for the Zweihanders. That said, if you can buff them especially, they will do very solid work for you. They're hard to mass, harder than most of your other Ulmish units because they do require a ton of resources. This is basically like a middle-age Ulm unit in the late age. It's not bad. It's worth recruiting, especially in certain circumstances. This is the unit that you will turn to kill heavy cavalry and to hold enemy units off of your rangers. Well, to be honest, you turn to the rangers to kill heavy cavalry, but the Zweihanders do pretty good work. Ghoul Guardians are basically just guardians, except they're undead and they don't need to eat. So there's that going for them. They do have dark vision, So basically they synergize better with all the death magic that Ulm has from their vampires. The Black Halberds still do the same. They still hurt sacred units, so you can use these guys to fend off sacred rushes with their extremely high damage and the extra fatigue. They have the Black Steel, so their protection is very high. And their combat speed is very, very low, but they're tanky enough to deal with it. They also have 16 hit points, so they're fairly tough for human-sized units, and they have a castle defense bonus of 2, so if you want to defend a castle, stacking Ghoul Guardians in it is a fantastic idea. For one thing, they have high siege defense. For another thing, since they don't eat, the castle won't run out of supplies. Normally, if a castle is sieged for about 4 or 5 turns, which is a long siege, but sometimes happens, the troops inside run out of supplies and start starving, then they get diseased, then they all die. Ghoul Guardians do not have that problem. They can defend a castle forever. Finally, Late Age Ulm has Sacreds, which Middle Age Ulm didn't have. They have the Black Templars, and Black Templars are extremely powerful. They are heavy cavalry, but better across the board, as well as blessable. They have high attack stats, they do high damage, they have extremely high protection, their defense skill is decent. The only downside to them is they cost the Earth. They have 46 recruitment points, which is standard for heavy cavalry. They also cost 73 resources, which makes it really, really rough to mass them up. If you want to mass Black Templars and expand with them, that is completely viable, but you have to tailor your build to do it. Like, you have to take Production 3 just for Black Templars. For Black Templars and Ghoul Guardians. It will also, as a side note, let you produce a lot of Zweihanders, or relatively a lot of Zweihanders. You'll never get more than probably 4 or 5 a turn. But, well, maybe you might get up to about 7 in your capital. But I don't tend to play Late Age Ulm that way with really, really high production, just because these units don't need it, and those units, are, especially Rangers, are what you're going to be leaning on mostly. Some Ghoul Guardians are nice, so taking 1 or 2 production to make sure you can churn out a few Ghoul Guardians per turn from your capital is probably a good idea, but I don't tend to lean on Black Templars too much. I feel like Ghoul Guardians do a decent job being a solid, hard-hitting unit, and I don't really need a whole lot of Black Templars. So, strategically speaking, Ulm's big thing is blood, and specifically vampires. What you want to do with Late Age Ulm is basically set up a pretender god in such a way that you can crap out vampires as quickly and as efficiently as possible. The classic way to do this is to take the Vampire Queen, who is a unique chassis to Late Age Ulm. She starts off with Death and Blood. She's invulnerable 25 and slash and blunt resistant plus regenerates. She has a life drain attack that can give her more HP. She is susceptible to fire, but she's also immortal. So every turn, if she died last turn, she reforms in your capital, and the process gets rid of most of her afflictions. So she never needs to be afraid of dying. She's stealthy. She summons vampires. She can never cross rivers, which is a definite downside, but she flies. So the Vampire Queen is actually a functional expander, because she effectively has 25 protection against anything that isn't a magical attack. Her skills are decent, and her life drain can help keep her alive. So by taking the Vampire Queen, you pump her up to about 4 points in Death and Blood. You give her some Dominion, then you worry about scales. I would generally tank, I'd probably tank Cold down to 3. Your units do not have cold resistance the way the EA Ulm units used to do, but it's either cold or heat. It doesn't actually matter which one you pick. You can certainly go heat 3. But your vampires are cold resistant, so cold 3 doesn't hurt you quite as much as it hurts a lot of other people. Then you do want to take growth. You probably want a point or 2 of production. You'd also like some magic, because you're going to be recruiting a lot of cheap human mages. You don't necessarily need order. If you look at your units, Ghoul Guardians are pretty much the only unit that requires a whole lot of recruitment points. Everything else is below 20. Your basic infantry are 9. So if you're recruiting a lot of Infantry of Ulm, which are going to be kind of your standard chaff, you really don't need recruitment points all that much. So I wouldn't worry about tanking Turmoil down a couple of points. That can give you room to kick up one or two of your paths. 4 is really all you need in order to forge the things that you'll need to forge and boost the things that you need to boost. You may want to kick blood up or death up. Probably not blood. You don't need to kick blood any higher. You may want to kick death up a little bit. But in terms of blessed, this lets you get blood surge and then probably undying, to be honest. Since your god is undead, undying is just straight extra HP for her. So 6 times undying makes her HP 28. And the blood surge, once she's killed somebody, I think that would be enough to make her a decent expander. If you took more blood, you could go up to blood vengeance, or add some strength of the flesh or something. But basically, this is kind of the standard path. You could use those points just to take more, you don't really need Dominion, to be honest. But you could use these points to take more scale. So you could take, like, Magic 3 if you wanted your research to be really, really efficient. Magic 3 would mean your Fortune Tellers are giving you 12 for 95, and your Illuminated ones are giving you 10 for 75, both of which are definitely good deals. Even your Black Priests are almost efficient if you do it that way, because they're sacred, so they cost half upkeep. So upkeep-wise, 64 gold per year, compared to 76 for Fortune Tellers, and 60 for Illuminated ones. So, the main strategy for Ulm is just blood and death. Blood and death, blood and death, blood and death. Crap out vampires as quickly as you possibly can, just to make sure that you have blood 3 and death 3 available on the same mage at the start, which means your Pretender God, as I said. And anytime you have 44 blood slaves, you cast Sanguine Heritage and you set that vampire count to blood hunting somewhere. And that means you get 44 slaves again more quickly, and you cast Sanguine Heritage again, and you set that vampire count to blood hunting somewhere, and thus and such. Once you have 3 or 4 vampire counts, you'll be pulling in, 20 slaves per turn, and summoning a vampire count every other turn. Once you have 6 or 8 vampire counts, you're pulling in 50 blood slaves per turn, and you're summoning a vampire count every turn. At that point, you go critical. Late Age Ulm goes nuclear probably faster than any other nation in the game, and if they go nuclear, they are a bitch to stop. Vampires are all immortal, so killing them does not stop them, they just come right back. And so basically, Ulm's mages don't die. Their ability to fight doesn't decrease until you kill them off entirely, which makes invading Ulm an enormous pain in the neck. Because if you invade Ulm, you will be fighting vampires who will be doing things like throwing Shadow Blast and summoning imps and casting agony on your troops. The provinces that you take will be raided back from you by vampires who are flying into your back line and using horde of skeletons to shut off your route of retreat, so if you ever lose a battle, your whole army dies. Late Age Ulm is a huge problem. Now, here's how they pay for that. They pay for that by having a weak early game. None of their mages are individually powerful until they start getting vampires. Their troops are mediocre. These guys are decent but expensive, especially in resources. Ghoul Guardians are powerful but not sacred or blessable and vulnerable to being shot to death with crossbows. Protection 22 against a crossbow. Like, look, these crossbows do 11 piercing damage, right? So they cut protection in half, which makes it 11. And they subtract 20%. So effectively, Ghoul Guardians are protection like 8 point something against 11 damage. They're going to be shot down if you have many crossbows. And gold 20, resources 42, recruitment points 47. You could easily have 2 or 3 crossbows for every Ghoul Guardian. And that kind of ratio means the Ghoul Guardians get shot. Same thing with Black Templars. Black Templars are very powerful and effective units, but against crossbows, they get shot down. They do have shields, which makes them a lot less vulnerable to crossbows. But things like Earthmeld really shut down Black Templars. Destruction shuts down Black Templars by destroying their armor. Yes, it's the full plate of Ulm and it's technically magic, but it is still vulnerable to destruction. It says it's much more resistant to hostile magic that tries to destroy it. I have found that to be a lie. I don't think that actually has any effect. If it has any effect, it's hard to notice. I don't know what the mechanics are behind it, but in general, if you cast destruction on things with magical armor, the magical armor still breaks. Now, forged items, if you make a black steel plate and equip it on a commander, that seems to be more resistant to destruction and armor of Achilles than those spells. But this kind of stuff, the magic armor that Ulm's troops wear, the magic armor that Acolytes wear, etc., destruction wrecks it just like it wrecks mundane armor. So, basically, if Late Age Ulm is in the game, you either rush them down and try to kill them year 0 or year 1, or you are doomed to the vampire apocalypse, because it is gonna happen. Now, there are other ways to play Ulm. If you don't want to take a Blood Death Vampire Queen, Ulm has some other chassis. You could take a Thrice-Horned Boar, who is a classic fantastic expander, and just expand with him. It does mean that you're not getting vampires, which means you're playing Ulm... I would say which means you're playing Late Age Ulm wrong, but having that rapid expansion can definitely be helpful, and it is possible, albeit slower, to ratchet your way up to vampires off of members of the second tier, or potentially fortune tellers. I'll be honest, I don't think it's a good idea to take anything except a vampire queen for Ulm, because you really want to start crapping out vampire counts as quickly as possible. They are by far Ulm's greatest national strength, to such a degree that Silt, the mod that a lot of people use that changes immortal summoning spells to transform the caster into immortals, if you play with Silt, nobody plays Late Age Ulm. It breaks the nation completely, because the nation is so heavily dependent on that Grey Goose scenario, on being able to spam out vampires and become just a death ball of immortal mages constantly cycling in and out of combat. Other options. You have the Son of Fenrir, who can be a quickness chassis, and a quickened Son of Fenrir is very dangerous indeed, with the +7 Berserk pushing his protection up to 20 and his attack also up to 20. Oh, and of course he starts with Jotun Wolves, which are also sacred and so are automatically blessed in his presence. What else do you have? You have dragons, so you can expand with dragons. You have the Lenormand. You have the Svartalf Master Smith, and the Svartalf Master Smith is probably the other option for vampire access, because blood is cheap on him. So you can take 4 death and 4 blood almost as cheaply as the Vampire Queen. You have to ditch a couple of scales in order to do it, but the Lenormand is a somewhat more effective expander and can forge more effectively. So you don't actually have to take 4 death, for example, if you don't want to, on the Lenormand, because the Lenormand has that... because the Svartalf Master Smith has a Master Smith bonus, he doesn't necessarily have to have 4 death. You can take 3 death and 3 blood, which is all you actually need to cast Sanguine Heritage. The 3 death and 3 blood there. That saves you a few points. You don't get a bless if you do that, but you could do things something like, you could take Earth and give him fire and shock resistance, or something. You could take a rainbow spread of paths. I would kick your Dominion up to 4. You could take a little bit of a rainbow spread of paths in order to make forging possible, like you could give him the Earth Astral Cross path, so that you can forge crystal items with him. This is probably the other... To my mind, this is the other viable pretender over the Vampire Queen. He's not quite as good at crapping out vampires as quickly as possible, but he's a better expander, and he gives you some forging capability. The downside is you're probably sacrificing any vestige of bless in order to do this, which means you're definitely not expanding with Black Templars. He can expand without a bless. The Lenormand can do it. If you'd like, you can definitely lose some more scales in order to get a bless. Like, you could go Earth 4, you could go Astral 4. Astral 4 might actually be a decent one for magic resistance, if nothing else. You could go Death 4. Well, going Death 4 makes it difficult to get anything else. But like I said, you don't need these up to 4, because of his forging bonus. He can still forge both Death boosters with Death 3, and then ramp up from there. That gets him up to death 5. Then you just have to get up to death 6 somehow, which you can do with Astral by forging the Ring of Sorcery. And he can do that from Astral... I think he needs to be Astral 4, because he needs to boost up to 6. No, he can do it from Astral 3. He can forge a Starshine Skullcap and a Crystal Coin. That'll boost him up to Astral 5. His Master Smith bonus makes him 6. And then he can forge the Ring of Sorcery, which will boost his blood and his death. So that's an option. You could do this. You could literally go just 3 across the board. You could get 2, and you could get 1 in some other path. With 31 points, you could kick your Dominion up to 5. This is an option, and he is, like I said, he's a better expander than the Vampire Queen because he has multiple attacks and fear, and the Dragon Gas, which is an AoE. Do have to be a little bit careful with him because he's not immortal. He won't come right back like the Vampire Queen will, which, to be honest, I think is the Vampire Queen's best feature. You can throw her into battle and have her die, and she just comes right back. Whoop, there she is. She has map move 22 and she's flying. She can just zip back to wherever she needs to be. Rivers can be a pain, but that's all. She can cross everything else. So that's Late Age Ulm. Like Middle Age Ulm, they're fairly straightforward. They are more complex in terms of what they can do because members of the second tier do have these randoms, and because they can make very, very powerful use of communions and sabbaths. So Late Age Ulm can get a lot of death magic in combat, they can get a lot of nature magic in combat, they can get a lot of astral magic in combat, and they can get cross paths. So Late Age Ulm can cast, for example, they can cast the high-level Death Astral Cross Path evocations, Nether Darts. They can cast, which causes Feeble Mind and does a whole bunch of armor-piercing damage. It is magic resistance negates, but it's a wide area of effect, and it does a ton of damage. They can cast, if they get Fire Cross Paths, they can cast Blood Boil and Hellfire, which are quite decent combat spells. Hellfire does armor-piercing fire damage in a wide area of effect. It hits 6 squares at a time, which is very, very solid. They have tons and tons of options. They can send horrors. Late Age Ulm can send horrors extremely effectively, almost as effectively as Abyssia. They can summon basically all of the blood summons. But the main thing that Ulm is known for is vampires, and lots of them. So, that's the end of the Ulm series. We've gone from Early Age Ulm, mainly stealthy troops, raiders, and earth and nature magic with a sideline in death and some elemental paths, to Middle Age Ulm, which is almost entirely earth with a sideline in fire, and based on having some of the strongest troops in the game, all the way up to Late Age Ulm, where troops take a secondary line to the vampire death ball and the apocalyptic encroachment of blood magic onto the world. And that's the end of that. So next time we're going to move on to one of the other nations. We may continue doing this early to middle to late kind of progression, or I might just try to finish off the Late Age nations. I do find the Late Age interesting, although it is, as I've said before, where I've played the least. I think next we might talk about the pop kill nations. We might kind of do a thematically linked series where we talk about Relay and Ermor and Lemuria and I always forget its name. It's Pangea but evil. We're Asphodel, that's right, the Carrion Woods. Because pop kill is an interesting mechanic. I think it's badly done, to be fully honest. I think pop kill nations are overall probably negative for the game, but it is a fascinating idea, and I would kind of I want to like it. I just want it to be not what it is, which is hugely, highly, incredibly annoying. And just it just kind of lowers fun for everyone. But in any case, that will be next time. So if you like what you've seen today, consider subscribing to the channel. If you really enjoy what I do and want to support it and be an enabler, Feel free to check out my Patreon. Donations are accepted, both in money and in kind. Please don't send me sheep. Send me beer if you're sending anything. But in any case, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.